This code protects everything I own, so why can't anyone in this room read it? Richard Caldwell's voice cut through the glass-walled boardroom, sharp and controlled, but edged with something unfamiliar, something close to urgency, and the moment the words landed, the room went still, not quiet in the comfortable way, but tight, like the air itself had been pulled thinner, like every person seated at the long polished table suddenly remembered how much they had to lose if they failed him, and one by one. Eyes dropped back to the pages spread before them, pages filled with symbols that looked almost like language but refused to behave like one, looping characters, broken sequences, fragments that felt intentional yet impossible to translate, and across from him, a senior analyst cleared his throat, tapping a tablet that had already run 3 separate decryption models, all returning the same answer, nothing, while another specialist adjusted his glasses, flipping through printed copies as if the answer might reveal itself through persistence alone, but it didn't. It never did, because for the past 48 hours, every expert Richard Caldwell could summon had tried and failed, linguists, cryptographers, even a custom AI trained on obscure dialects, and still, nothing, just silence wrapped in expensive suits and quiet panic, and near the far wall, just beyond the reflection of the city skyline bleeding through the glass, a small figure stood unnoticed. Her presence almost erased by design, a child in an oversized gray hoodie, sleeves rolled unevenly at the wrists, holding a damp cloth that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, her sneakers squeaking softly against the marble floor each time she shifted her weight, her name badge tilted sideways, the letters slightly faded, Amara Johnson, 9 years old, though no one here would guess it mattered, because to them, she wasn't part of the room, she was part of the background. Like the hum of the air conditioning or the distant traffic 27 floors below. Something that existed but didn't require acknowledgement, and still, her eyes were fixed on the pages, not scanning like the others, not searching for meaning in the obvious places, but tracing the patterns, the spacing, the way certain symbols repeated not in order but in rhythm, like something she had seen before, something that didn't belong to language at all. And as Richard exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against the bridge of his nose, Evelyn Price leaned forward slightly, her voice low but precise. "We need more time," she said, though even she knew time wasn't the issue, and he didn't respond, not immediately, because his gaze had drifted. Just for a fraction of a second, toward the glass, toward the reflection, and in that reflection, he saw movement that didn't belong to the polished certainty of his world, a small hand lifting, hesitating, then lowering again, like a thought that wasn't sure it deserved to exist, and he turned slightly, not enough to draw attention, just enough to confirm what he thought he saw, the girl, still standing there, still watching. And Evelyn followed his glance, her expression tightening almost instantly. "Staff shouldn't be in here," she said, sharper now, already rising from her seat. But before she could move, the girl stepped back half a step, not in fear, but in awareness, like she understood the rules without being told. And yet, her eyes didn't leave the pages, not even when she lowered her gaze for a moment, pressing the damp cloth against the glass in a slow circular motion that left a faint trail of moisture, and for a brief second, the reflection shifted. The symbols bending, aligning differently, just enough to reveal something hidden in plain sight, and Amara's fingers stilled, her breath catching so quietly no one heard it, but her mind didn't. It moved, fast and certain, connecting lines that weren't meant to be connected, seeing structure where others saw chaos, and behind her, the city lights flickered to life one by one as evening settled in, casting a colder glow across the room. A glow that sharpened edges, deepened shadows, and made everything feel more exposed than it had just moments before, and at the table, another executive shook his head, frustration breaking through. "It's not a language," he muttered, almost to himself, and for the first time. Amara's lips parted slightly, as if the words had been waiting, as if they had been sitting just behind her teeth this entire time, ready to step into a world that wasn't meant for her. But she didn't speak, not yet, because something in the room still said she wasn't supposed to, that this space, this moment, didn't belong to her, and still, her eyes lifted again, steady now, certain, watching the man at the head of the table. The one everyone else watched, the one who controlled everything in this room, And for the first time that day, Richard Caldwell felt something shift, subtle, almost imperceptible, like a crack forming beneath a surface he had always believed was unbreakable. "Say that again," Richard said quietly, not raising his voice, but the shift in tone was enough to pull every eye back to him, and for a moment, no one spoke, because no one was sure who he was addressing, until his gaze settled, not on the executives, not on the analysts, but past them, toward the glass wall where the girl stood, still holding the cloth, still half-turned as if ready to disappear the second someone told her to. And Evelyn followed his line of sight again, sharper this time, stepping forward with controlled urgency. "Sir, she is just maintenance," she said, already reaching for the door as if to correct the situation before it could become one, but Richard lifted a single finger, not even looking at her, and she stopped mid-step, the room tightening again around that small gesture of authority. And then he spoke, not louder, but clearer. "You said something," he continued, his eyes now fully on the girl. "What did you mean by that?" And Amara froze, not because she was afraid, but because the moment had finally arrived, the invisible line she had been standing behind all her life now suddenly gone, and for a second, her fingers tightened around the damp cloth, the cool moisture seeping into her skin grounding her just enough to breathe, just enough to think, and when she spoke, her voice was small, but steady. "It is not a language," she said, repeating the words the executive had muttered, but with a certainty that made them feel different, heavier, like they carried something more than guesswork, and a few people at the table exchanged looks, one of them letting out a short, disbelieving laugh. "We already established that," he said, leaning back in his chair. "That is the problem." But Amara shook her head slightly, her eyes never leaving the pages. "No," she said softly. "You are trying to read it like words, but it does not want to be read that way." And that was when the room shifted again, subtle, almost imperceptible, but real, because now it was not just a child speaking, it was an idea entering a space that had run out of answers, and Richard leaned back slowly in his chair, studying her, not dismissing, not interrupting, just watching, the way he did when something finally caught his attention, and Evelyn's voice came again, tighter now. "This is inappropriate," she said. "We cannot have a child interrupting a high-level review." But Richard did not respond to her this time, his focus locked on Amara as if the rest of the room had dimmed around her. "Then what is it?" he asked, and for a moment, Amara hesitated, not because she did not know, but because she did, and saying it out loud meant stepping even further into a world that had never made space for her. But she took a small step forward anyway, her sneakers barely making a sound against the floor, and she reached the edge of the table, close enough now to see the pages without the distortion of glass reflections. And she placed the cloth down carefully beside her, as if setting something aside before beginning something important, and then she pointed, not randomly, but precisely, tracing a sequence of symbols that curved and repeated in uneven intervals. "It moves," she said, and a few eyebrows lifted, confusion flickering across faces that were used to understanding things quickly. "Moves how?" Richard asked, his voice lower now, more controlled, and Amara inhaled slowly, her fingers hovering just above the page, not touching it yet, like a pattern, she said. "Not left to right, not top to bottom, it loops, like it is following something." And she paused, searching for the right words, not technical ones, just true ones. "Like a heartbeat." And that was when the silence deepened, not empty, but charged, because something about that word landed differently, something about it connected in a way the algorithms had not, and Richard's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for Evelyn to notice, enough for her to step in again. "Sir, with respect, this is speculation," she said, her tone firm now, almost protective. "We have experts working on this." But Richard raised his hand again, slower this time, his gaze still fixed on the girl. "Let her finish," he said, and this time, no one argued, not because they agreed, but because something in his voice made it clear that the decision had already been made, and Amara swallowed, feeling the weight of every eye in the room now. But she did not look at them, she looked at the page, because that was where the truth was, and slowly, carefully, She reached out and turned the paper slightly, angling it under the light, and as she did, the symbols seemed to shift again, not physically, but in the way they aligned, the way they repeated, and she traced them again, faster this time, more confident. "It is not hiding information," she said, almost to herself. "It is hiding the way to read it." And Richard leaned forward now, elbows resting lightly on the table, the first real movement he had made in minutes. "And you can see it?" he asked, not challenging, just asking, and Amara nodded once, small but certain. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I can." And somewhere near the end of the table, someone shifted in their seat, the sound of leather against fabric loud in the silence, and another person exhaled slowly, as if unsure whether to believe what they were hearing, but no one laughed this time, no one interrupted, because something had changed, something quiet but undeniable, and for the first time since the meeting began, the room was not frozen by failure, it was waiting. And Richard Caldwell, a man who trusted very little, and no one without reason, held the girl's gaze for a long second before speaking again, his voice steady, decisive. "Show me." Amara did not move right away, not because she was unsure, but because she understood something no one else in the room seemed to notice, that this moment was not about being fast, it was about being right, and rushing would break something fragile that had just begun to form. So instead, she reached for the paper slowly, her fingers careful, almost respectful, as if the symbols on the page were not just ink but something alive, something that needed to be handled with intention, and when she finally lifted the top sheet, the faint rustle echoed louder than it should have in the quiet room, drawing every eye tighter toward her, and for a brief second, the weight of their attention pressed in, heavy and unfamiliar, but she did not look up, she kept her focus on the page, because that was where the answer lived, not in the faces around her, and she turned the paper 90 degrees, not fully, just enough to break the way it had been presented, and a few people shifted again, confusion returning. One executive leaning forward as if to object, but stopping himself when Richard did not react, and Amara exhaled softly, her breath barely visible in the cool, conditioned air, as she traced the symbols again, this time not reading them, but following them, her finger moving in curved paths that crossed over lines and ignored what others had assumed were boundaries, and as she moved, something subtle began to emerge, not to the room, not yet, but to her, a rhythm. A repetition that did not belong to letters or words, but to something more physical, more human, and she whispered it without realizing. 1, 2, 3, pause, 1, 2, pause. Her voice barely audible, but enough for Richard to lean in slightly, his eyes narrowing not in skepticism, but in focus, and Evelyn watched from the side, her posture rigid, her arms now crossed tightly as if holding on to control that was slipping inch by inch, and Amara continued, her finger moving faster now, connecting points that had been invisible before, and then she stopped, not abruptly, but with a quiet certainty, her hand resting on a cluster of symbols near the center of the page, and she looked up for the first time, her eyes meeting Richard's, not with defiance, not with fear, but with clarity. "It is not random," she said, her voice steadier now. "It repeats, but not the way a code repeats, it follows something steady, something that changes just a little each time." And Richard tilted his head slightly, the movement small but intentional. "Like what?" he asked, and Amara hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not because she doubted herself, but because the answer felt too simple for a room like this, too human for something everyone else had treated like a machine problem, and then she said it, like a heartbeat. And this time, the word did not just land, it settled deep, quiet, undeniable, and for a moment, no one spoke, not even the ones who had been quick to dismiss her before, because something about the way she said it made it harder to ignore, and Richard leaned back slowly, his gaze dropping to the page, then back to her, as if recalibrating something internal, something he had not expected to revisit. And Amara lowered her eyes again, returning to the paper, her confidence building not from the room's reaction, but from the pattern itself, and she began to move again, faster now, more certain, her finger tracing a looping path that cut across sections the experts had treated as separate, and as she followed it, she began to speak, not in full sentences, but in fragments. This part, it matches this one, but shifted, like time moved. And she flipped the page beneath it, aligning edges, rotating slightly, and suddenly the repetition became visible, not obvious, but present, like something just beneath the surface finally catching the light, and one of the analysts leaned forward sharply, his eyes widening as he saw it too. "Wait," he said under his breath. "That is not a coincidence." And another person reached for their copy, adjusting it the same way, trying to follow her movement, but they were already behind, because Amara was not translating, she was understanding, and there was a difference, and she continued, her voice gaining a quiet rhythm of its own. "It speeds up here, slows down here, like it is reacting." And Richard's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the table, not visibly to most, but enough to signal something shifting beneath his calm exterior, and Evelyn noticed, her eyes flicking between him and the girl, calculation replacing certainty, and Amara stopped again, this time at the bottom corner of the page, where a cluster of symbols curved inward tightly, almost like they were protecting something, and she did not touch them right away. She hovered, her hand suspended just above the paper, and when she spoke, her voice softened, almost reverent. "This is the start," she said. "Not the top, not the first line, this," and she tapped lightly, the smallest contact, but it echoed louder than anything else in the room, and Richard leaned forward again, closer now, his voice lower, almost careful. "How do you know?" he asked, and Amara looked at the page, then at him, and for the first time, there was something like emotion in her expression, not fear, not pride, but recognition. "Because everything comes back to it," she said quietly, and the room held that sentence like it might break if anyone spoke too soon, and in that stillness, the power in the room shifted again, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that the girl who had walked in unnoticed was no longer invisible, and Richard Caldwell, who had built his world on control and certainty, found himself doing something he had not done in a long time. He waited. No one moved to interrupt her this time, not even Evelyn, whose silence now felt less like control and more like calculation, as if she was trying to understand whether stopping this would cost more than allowing it to continue. And at the center of the room, Amara stood still for a moment longer, her small hand hovering above the cluster she had identified as the beginning, her breathing slow, steady, as if she were aligning herself with something unseen, and then she lowered her finger again, tracing outward from that point, not in straight lines, but in arcs that curved and returned, looping back in ways that made no sense to anyone watching, yet made perfect sense to her, and as she moved, she began to speak again, quieter now, almost like she was reading something meant only for her. "It does not start with meaning," she said softly. "It starts with feeling." And a few heads tilted, confusion mixing with something else, something closer to unease, because this was no longer technical, no longer something that could be solved with data or algorithms, and Richard did not look away, his attention fixed completely on her, his expression unreadable, but his stillness louder than any reaction, and Amara continued, her finger moving faster now, more confident, her path across the page forming a pattern that began to repeat in her voice. Fast. Then slow, then pause, like it is remembering. And she shifted the page again, aligning it with another, her hands working instinctively, guided by something deeper than logic, and suddenly, the room saw it, not fully, not clearly, but enough to recognize that there was structure where they had seen chaos, and one of the analysts leaned forward sharply, his breath catching. "That is a sequence," he said under his breath, almost afraid to say it out loud, and another person mirrored her movement, rotating their copy, tracing the same loops, trying to catch up, but they could not, because Amara was not decoding, she was following, and there was a difference that could not be taught in a room like this, and she stopped again, this time not at a symbol, but at a space between them, a gap that had been dismissed as nothing, and she tapped it lightly. "This is where it changes," she said, and Richard's voice came, low, measured. "Changes how?" And Amara looked at the page, then back at him, her eyes clearer now than they had been before. "It skips," she said. "Like something is missing, but it is not missing, it is just not supposed to be seen the same way." And the room tightened again, not with tension, but with focus, every person leaning in just a little more, as if proximity might help them understand what she was seeing. And Amara inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling with the breath, grounding herself again before continuing, and then she did something no one expected. She closed her eyes, just for a second, her fingers still resting lightly on the page, and in that brief pause, the room held its breath with her, and when she opened them again, she did not look at the symbols first, she looked at Richard, and for a moment, it felt like she was asking permission without words, not to continue, but to go deeper, and he did not speak, but he did not look away there, and that was enough, and she turned back to the page, her voice steadier now, more certain. "It is not just a pattern," she said. "It is a path." And she began to trace it again, this time faster, her finger moving in a continuous motion that connected sections across multiple pages. And as she followed it, her voice shifted, no longer describing, but interpreting. "This part, it is not numbers, it is time," she said. "Not minutes, not hours, something else." And she paused, her brow furrowing slightly, not in confusion, but in concentration. "Moments," she added quietly. "Like something that happened." And that word landed differently, heavier, more personal, and Richard's posture changed, just slightly, his shoulders tightening, his gaze sharpening in a way that had nothing to do with business, and Evelyn saw it, her eyes narrowing as she watched him, as if she was witnessing a door opening that she had spent years keeping closed, and Amara continued, her fingers slowing now as she reached the center again, the place she had marked as the beginning, and she traced outward once more, her voice almost a whisper. "It starts here, and everything comes back." And she stopped, her hand resting flat against the page now, her breathing steady, and she looked up. Again, meeting Richard's eyes, and this time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just quiet clarity. "It is not protecting something," she said. "It is remembering something." And the silence that followed was different from before, deeper, heavier, not because they did not understand, but because they were beginning to, and Richard Caldwell, a man who had built his empire on control, precision, and distance, felt something shift inside him, something he had not allowed space for in years. And for the first time since the meeting began, he did not look at the pages, he looked at the girl, and he asked, his voice softer than it had been all day, "Can you read it?" Amara did not answer right away, and for a moment, the silence that followed Richard's question felt heavier than anything that had come before, because this was no longer about patterns or theory, it was about crossing a line that could not be uncrossed, and she looked down at the page again, her small hand still resting on the paper, feeling the faint texture beneath her fingertips, grounding herself in something real before stepping into something deeper. And when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. "But clearer." "Yes," she said, "but not the way you think." And a faint shift moved through the room, not resistance, not dismissal, but anticipation, something none of them had expected to feel again after hours of failure, and Richard leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving her. "Then show me how," he said, and Amara nodded once, a small motion, but certain, and she adjusted the pages again, aligning them not by edges, but by the flow she had discovered, turning one sheet halfway, sliding another just an inch to the left, movements that looked random until they were not, until the shapes began to echo each other in ways that made the space between them feel intentional, and then she began, her finger moving slowly along the path she had traced before, her voice following behind it, not reading symbols, but translating movement into meaning. "It starts with a memory," she said, and the word landed differently this time, no longer abstract, no longer distant, and Richard's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, his jaw setting just slightly as if something had been touched that he had not expected anyone to reach, and Amara continued, her voice steady, guided by the rhythm she now understood. "Not a big one, a small one, something you did not think mattered." And she paused, her finger hovering over a curve in the pattern. "It repeats, because you keep going back to it." And a quiet shift passed through the room, the kind that does not make a sound but changes everything, and one of the analysts lowered his gaze, as if suddenly aware that this was no longer his place to interpret, and Evelyn stood completely still now, her earlier certainty replaced with something more cautious, more observant, and Amara moved again, following the path as it looped and stretched, her voice gaining a gentle rhythm, almost like she was listening as much as she was speaking. Then it changes, something happened, something that made everything faster, louder. And she swallowed lightly, not because the words were difficult, but because they carried weight, and she continued, quieter now. You tried to hide it, not from others, from yourself. And that was when Richard's hand tightened against the edge of the table, not enough to draw attention, but enough that the subtle movement rippled through the air, and for a moment, it felt like the room itself was holding its breath again, not out of confusion, but out of recognition, and Amara slowed her movement, her finger tracing the final loop that returned to the center, the place she had marked as the beginning, and when she spoke again. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried it. Ends the same place it starts, she said, because you never left it. And she stopped, her hand resting flat on the page once more, her eyes lifting slowly to meet Richard's, and in that moment, there was no distance between them, no difference in status or power, just two people connected by something invisible and deeply human, and the room remained silent, not because there was nothing to say, but because no one trusted themselves to say it without breaking whatever had just happened, and Richard did not speak immediately, his gaze fixed on her, searching, not for flaws, not for mistakes, but for something else, something he had not allowed himself to look for in a long time, and when he finally moved, it was slow, deliberate, his hand reaching out to the page, not to take it, but to feel it, his fingers brushing lightly against the paper where hers had been. As if trying to understand how something so simple could hold something so complex, and when he spoke, his voice was lower than it had been all day, almost careful. That is not a translation, he said, and Amara shook her head gently, her expression calm. No, she replied. It is not meant to be translated. And she paused. Just for a second, before adding, it is meant to be understood. And something in the room shifted again, quieter this time, deeper, as if the truth of that statement settled into every corner of the space, and Richard exhaled slowly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his shoulders lowering just slightly, the tension in his posture easing in a way that had nothing to do with business or strategy, and everything to do with something far more personal, and for the first time since the meeting began, he leaned back in his chair not as a man in control, but as a man processing something he could not ignore, and across from him, the executives sat in silence, no longer questioning, no longer doubting, because whatever they had just witnessed was not something that could be explained away, and at the edge of the table, Amara reached for her cloth again, her fingers wrapping around it as if returning to something familiar, something safe, and she stepped back half a step, not retreating, just creating space, her role in the moment complete, and as the city lights outside reflected across the glass walls, casting soft patterns of gold and blue across the room, Richard Caldwell looked at the pages in front of him, then back at the girl who had seen what no one else could, and in that quiet space between them, something unspoken settled, something that did not need to be named to be real. The room did not return to normal after that, it could not, because something had been revealed that could not be put back into silence, and for a long moment, no one reached for their tablets, no one typed, no one even shifted in their seats, as if the smallest movement might break whatever fragile understanding had just settled over the space, and at the center of it all, Richard remained still, his gaze resting on the pages but not seeing them the same way anymore, because now they were no longer a problem to solve, they were something else entirely, something personal, something exposed, and across from him, Evelyn finally moved, just a slight adjustment of her posture, but enough to signal that she was recalculating, adapting, her voice returning carefully. Measured, sir, she said, not interrupting, but entering the space with precision. We still need a formal interpretation for the board. And the words felt out of place the second they landed, too structured for what had just happened, too detached, and Richard did not look at her right away, his attention still anchored to the pages, to the girl, to something deeper than procedure, and when he finally spoke, His voice was quieter than before, not weaker, but different. "There is no formal interpretation," he said, and that sentence shifted the air again, because it was not just an answer, it was a decision, and Evelyn paused, just for a fraction of a second, before responding, her tone still controlled but tighter now. "Then what do we present?" she asked, and Richard leaned back slowly, his fingers resting lightly on the table, not gripping it anymore, not holding on to control the way he had earlier, and he exhaled once, long and steady, as if releasing something he had been carrying for far longer than this meeting. "Nothing," he said, and that word landed heavier than anything else, because it was not avoidance, it was acknowledgement, and around the table, a few heads lifted, surprise flickering across faces that had expected direction, strategy, something actionable, and instead, they were given absence. And at the edge of the room, Amara shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around the cloth again, not out of fear, but because she felt the weight of what had just happened, even if she did not fully understand it, and Richard turned his head then, finally looking at her again, not as a distraction, not as an anomaly, but as someone who had changed the direction of the room without raising her voice, and he studied her for a long second, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable, but deliberate, and when he spoke, it was not to the room, it was to her. "What is your name?" he asked, and the question, simple as it was, carried something different now, something that acknowledged her presence in a way no one else had before, and Amara straightened slightly, her voice quiet but clear. "Amara Johnson," she said, and Richard nodded once, a small motion, but intentional, as if committing it to memory, and then he asked something no one expected, something that did not belong in a boardroom. "Who taught you to see things like that?" And Amara blinked once, not because she did not know, but because the question reached somewhere deeper than the others had, and she looked down for a moment, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the cloth, grounding herself again before answering. "My dad," she said softly. "He used to say that not everything is meant to be solved, some things are meant to be felt first." And the words settled into the room with a quiet weight, and Richard's gaze shifted slightly, something in his expression tightening, not in resistance, but in recognition, and for a brief moment, the distance between his world and hers collapsed completely, replaced by something shared, something human, and Evelyn watched it happen, her eyes narrowing just slightly, not in disapproval, but in awareness, because this was not just a moment, it was a shift, and she understood shifts, she understood how quickly they could change everything if left unchecked, and yet, she did not interrupt, because even she could see that this was not something that could be controlled the way everything else in this room had been, and across the table, one of the analysts finally leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as if releasing tension he had not realized he was holding, and another closed his tablet quietly, the soft click echoing more than it should have, marking the end of something that had not been officially concluded, and at the center, Richard reached for the pages again, but this time, he did not try to analyze them, he did not trace the symbols or search for patterns, he simply gathered them, aligning the edges carefully, almost respectfully, as if acknowledging what they had revealed, and then he placed them back on the table. Not as a problem, but as something complete, and when he looked up again, his voice was steady, but changed. "Meeting is over," he said, and no one questioned it, no one asked for clarification, because they all understood, even if they could not explain why, and chairs shifted, quiet movements filling the space as people began to stand collecting their things with less urgency than before, as if the pace of the room itself had slowed, and at the edge of it all, Amara stepped back another half step, her presence already beginning to fade into the background again, but not completely, not the way it had before, because now, every person in that room knew she had been there, and as she turned slightly, ready to return to the hallway, to the quiet rhythm of work that did not require her to be seen, Richard's voice came once more, not loud, not commanding, but enough to stop her. "Amara," he said, and she paused, turning back just enough to face him, and for a moment he did not speak, as if choosing his next words carefully, something he rarely needed to do, and then he said, "You did not just read it." And he paused, his gaze steady. You understood it. And Amara held his gaze for a second, then nodded once, small, simple, and without another word. She turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps soft against the marble, the faint scent of cleaner trailing behind her, and as the door closed quietly, the room remained still for just a moment longer, as if holding on to the echo of something that had already begun to change everything. The hallway outside the boardroom felt different the moment the door closed behind her, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound, as if the air itself had less weight, and Amara paused just for a second, her hand still on the cool metal handle, feeling the faint vibration of movement on the other side, voices beginning again, softer now, less certain, and then she let go. Turning back into the corridor where the polished floors stretched long and empty under rows of recessed lights. Each step she took echoing lightly, steady, familiar, the rhythm of a place where she knew exactly how to move without being noticed, and yet something inside her did not settle the same way it usually did, something stayed with her, something from that room, not the tension, not the attention, but the feeling of being seen, even if only for a moment, and she adjusted her grip on the cloth, folding it once more out of habit, her fingers working automatically while her thoughts moved somewhere else, and behind her, the boardroom door remained closed, but inside, things had not returned to normal, not even close, because Richard Caldwell had not moved for several seconds after she left, his gaze still fixed on the space where she had been standing, as if the room had not quite caught up to the fact that she was gone. And when he finally looked down at the stack of papers again, he did not pick them up immediately, he simply stared, the symbols no longer abstract, no longer distant, but tied now to something he could not ignore, something he had spent years building walls around, and across the table, Evelyn watched him carefully, her posture composed but her eyes sharper than before, calculating not the numbers on the page, but the shift in him, because she understood him better than anyone else in that room. Understood the way he compartmentalized, the way he separated personal from professional with precision, and what she had just witnessed did not fit into that structure, and that made it unpredictable, and unpredictability was something she did not allow to linger, so she spoke again, her voice measured, controlled. We can isolate the patterns she identified and run a structured analysis, she said, her tone neutral, almost clinical, as if framing the moment in familiar terms could pull it back into something manageable. But Richard did not respond right away, his fingers finally moving not to analyze, but to gather the pages again, aligning them slowly, deliberately, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, but final. No, he said, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, and Evelyn held his gaze for a second, searching for the reasoning behind it, but finding none that fit her expectations, and that was when she realized that this was not a decision based on logic, and that realization shifted something in her expression, subtle but real, and she leaned back slightly, adjusting her approach, because pushing now would not restore control, it would only expose the lack of it, and across the room, one of the executives cleared his throat quietly, unsure whether to speak or remain silent, caught between the old rhythm of the room and the new one that had not yet fully formed, and Richard stood then, slowly, the movement drawing attention without demanding it, and he gathered the pages into a single folder, closing it with a soft, final sound, and for a moment, he held it in his hand, not as a document, but as something personal. Something that no longer belonged on a conference table, and then he turned, not toward the door immediately, but toward the glass wall, the city stretching out below in layers of light and shadow, and his reflection looked back at him, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, and somewhere in that reflection, he saw not just himself, but the moment that had just happened, the small figure at the edge of the room, the quiet voice that had cut through hours of failure, and the words she had said. Not everything is meant to be solved, some things are meant to be felt first, and he exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it should have, and without turning, he spoke, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough for the room to hear. Cancel the review. And that instruction moved through the space with immediate effect, chairs shifting again, devices powering down, the machinery of the room responding to command even as the meaning behind it remained unclear, and Evelyn stood as well, her movements precise, controlled, but her eyes lingered. on him for a moment longer, as if committing this version of him to memory, because it was not one she had seen before, and as the room began to empty, the energy different now, quieter, less certain, Richard finally turned toward the door, the folder still in his hand, and he paused just briefly before stepping out into a hallway, the same hallway Amara had walked moments earlier, and for a second, he looked down its length. The polished floor reflecting the overhead lights in a long, uninterrupted line, and at the far end, just barely visible, a small figure moving steadily, blending back into the rhythm of a world that did not stop for moments like this, and he stood there, just long enough to register it, before he began to walk, not quickly, not urgently, but with a deliberate pace that carried something new, something he had not felt in a long time, not control, not pressure, but something quieter, something that did not need to be named to be understood. Amara did not look back as she walked, not because she was trying to leave anything behind, but because she had already returned to the rhythm she understood, one step, then another, the soft squeak of her sneakers echoing gently along the corridor, the faint scent of cleaner following her like a quiet signature of who she was in this building, someone who moved through spaces without changing them. Someone who restored order without being noticed, and yet today, something had shifted, not in the building, not in the polished floors or the glass walls, but in the way those spaces had briefly held her, acknowledged her, and as she turned the corner toward the service hallway, the lights grew softer, warmer, the hum of the main corridor fading into something more familiar, something quieter, and she exhaled slowly, a breath she did not realize she had been holding, her fingers loosening around the cloth as if releasing a tension she had carried without noticing, and she moved toward the supply cart parked neatly against the wall, its metal frame cool and steady, exactly where she had left it, and she reached for the handle, her hand settling into place with practiced ease, grounding her again in the simple, predictable world she knew, and for a moment, she stood there, not moving, just feeling the stillness, the quiet that followed something important, something she did not fully understand but knew had mattered. And far behind her, in the brighter corridor she had just left, Richard continued walking, his pace unhurried, his footsteps measured against the marble floor, each step echoing slightly in the wide, open space, and as he moved, people noticed, not because he demanded attention, but because he always carried it with him. Conversations paused, eyes shifted, subtle acknowledgments passed between employees who understood the hierarchy without needing it spoken, and yet today, something about him felt different, not outwardly, not in the way he carried himself, but in the slight delay of his gaze, the way his attention lingered just a second longer than usual, as if something internal had not yet settled, and when he reached the intersection where the hallway split toward the executive offices and the service corridors, he slowed, not stopping, just enough to notice the direction she had gone. And for a brief second, he considered following, the thought passing through his mind without urgency, without clear intention, just a quiet pull, and then he continued forward, not because the thought had no weight, but because he was not yet ready to act on something he did not fully understand, and back in the service hallway, Amara began to move again, pushing the cart slowly, the wheels rolling smoothly beneath her hands, the familiar rhythm returning, the gentle resistance of motion grounding her in something steady, and she stopped at the next glass panel, lifting the cloth again, her movements automatic, circular motions spreading faint streaks of moisture that caught the light before fading into clarity, and as she worked, her mind drifted, not to the room, not to the people, but to the feelings she had recognized in the patterns, the quiet pull of something remembered, something repeated, and for a moment, her hand slowed, the cloth pausing mid-motion against the glass. Her reflection staring back at her, small, steady, present, and she tilted her head slightly, studying it, not with doubt, but with curiosity, as if seeing herself from a different angle for the first time, and then she smiled, just a little, not wide, not bright, but real, and she returned to her work, the motion smoothing out again, the glass clearing beneath her hand, and in another part of the building, Richard stepped into his office, the door closing behind him with a soft, controlled sound, sealing off the noise of the hallway, and for a moment he stood there, the folder still in his hand, the room around him quiet, ordered, exactly as it had always been, and yet it did not feel the same, and he moved toward his desk, placing the folder down carefully, not opening it, not yet, just letting it rest there, and he walked past it to the window, the city stretching out beyond the glass, lights flickering in patterns that mirrored something he could not quite name, and he placed his hand lightly against the cool surface, his reflection overlapping with the skyline, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, not in avoidance, but in recognition, and the words came back to him. Not everything is meant to be solved, some things are meant to be felt first. And he exhaled slowly, the breath steady, deliberate, and when he opened his eyes again, the city looked the same, but he did not, and somewhere down the hall, out of sight, a small girl continued her work, unnoticed by most, but no longer invisible to all, her quiet presence leaving something behind that could not be measured, could not be analyzed, but could be felt, if someone chose to. The building settled into its evening rhythm as the last of the executives filtered out, their voices fading into distant echoes that blended with the steady hum of climate control and the soft glow of overhead lights. And in the service corridor, Amara continued moving at her quiet pace, the cart rolling smoothly beside her as she worked her way down the long stretch of glass panels, each one reflecting a slightly different version of the same world: polished floors, muted lighting, shadows stretching longer as the sun disappeared beyond the skyline, and she paused at one panel near the corner where the light shifted just enough to catch the reflection of the city outside, her cloth hovering mid-air as she studied the way the lights blinked on one by one in the distance, not in perfect order, not in clean lines, but in patterns that felt alive, shifting, almost like breathing, and she tilted her head slightly, watching. Not analyzing, not trying to understand, just observing, the way she always had, the way her father had taught her, to notice the things that moved beneath the surface, the things people overlooked because they were too busy looking for answers instead of meaning, and she lifted her hand again, wiping the glass slowly, the motion steady and deliberate, clearing away faint streaks until the reflection sharpened, until the city looked clearer, more defined, and for a moment she saw herself in it again, small against something vast, but not lost, not invisible, just present, and somewhere above her, several floors higher, Richard remained in his office, standing near the window, the folder still resting unopened on his desk. The room around him unchanged yet unfamiliar in a way he could not quite explain, and he turned slowly, his gaze drifting back to the desk, to the place where the pages waited, not as a problem, not as a challenge, but as something that held a part of him he had not expected anyone else to find, and he walked toward it, his steps quiet against the thick carpet, his hand reaching out not with urgency but with intention, and when he opened the folder this time, he did not scan the symbols the way he had before, he did not search for structure or hidden logic. He simply looked, letting the shapes exist as they were, letting the patterns settle into his awareness without forcing them into something else, and as he did, something shifted again, not in the pages, but in him, because now he could see what she had seen, not clearly, not completely, but enough to recognize that it was not meant to be decoded in the way he had been trying, and his fingers rested lightly on the paper, tracing a line slowly, following the curve not to understand it, but to feel it, and the movement was unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable at first. But he did not stop, and as he followed the path, the room seemed to quiet even further, the sounds of the building fading into the background until all that remained was the soft rustle of paper and the steady rhythm of his own breath. And he paused, his hand resting near the center of the page, the place she had marked, the place everything returned to, and he closed his eyes for just a second, not long, just enough to let something surface. Something he had not allowed himself to revisit in years, and when he opened them again, his expression had changed, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone else, but enough that the distance he had maintained from everything outside his control had softened, just slightly, and down in the service corridor, Amara finished the last panel, her cloth moving in one final smooth circle before she stepped back, examining her work with a quiet satisfaction that did not require acknowledgement, and she adjusted the cart, turning it carefully toward the storage room at the end of the hall, the wheels clicking softly as they crossed a seam in the floor, and as she walked, she passed a row of closed office doors, each one hiding a world she was not part of, each one carrying conversations, decisions, responsibilities far removed from her own, and yet today, for a brief moment, she had stepped into one of those worlds and changed something within it, even if no one outside that room would ever know, and she reached the storage room, pushing the door open gently with her shoulder, the familiar scent of cleaning supplies greeting her as she rolled the cart inside. The fluorescent lights flickering once before settling into a steady glow, and she parked the cart in its place, adjusting the cloths neatly, aligning everything the way it was meant to be, and for a moment she stood there, her hands resting lightly on the metal frame, the quiet wrapping around her again, comfortable, steady, and she smiled softly, not because something had ended, but because something had begun, even if she could not yet see what it would become. And upstairs, in a room of glass and silence, Richard Caldwell remained standing at his desk, his hands still resting on the page, his mind no longer racing for solutions, but settling into something deeper, something quieter, and for the first time in a long time, he did not reach for control, he did not try to reshape what was in front of him into something he could manage, he simply allowed it to be, and in that stillness, something shifted again, not loud, not visible, but real, and somewhere in the building. Two very different worlds continued to move forward, separate in structure, separate in purpose, but now, connected by a moment that neither of them would forget, even if they never spoke of it again. The night settled deeper around the building, the city outside no longer transitioning but fully alive in its evening rhythm, lights stretching across blocks like constellations mapped onto concrete, and inside his office, Richard remained where he stood, the pages still open before him, but now untouched, as if he understood that reaching for them again too quickly would pull him back into the same pattern he had just begun to step away from, and for a long moment, he did nothing. His reflection faint against the glass behind his desk, layered over the skyline, a man suspended between what he had always been and something he had not yet defined, and then, slowly, he closed the folder, not abruptly, not with finality, but with intention, as if acknowledging that whatever needed to be understood had already been revealed, and he turned away from the desk, his steps quieter now, less driven, carrying none of the urgency that had filled the room earlier, and he moved toward the door, his hand resting briefly on the handle before he paused, just for a second, not hesitating, but recognizing that stepping out now meant something different than it had before, and then he opened it, the hallway beyond stretching long and softly lit, and as he stepped out, the faint echo of his shoes against the polished floor followed him, steady, measured, and somewhere down that corridor, the service area remained lit in a softer glow, a quieter world running parallel to his own. And he walked in that direction without fully deciding to, his path guided by something quieter than logic, something that did not demand explanation, and at the end of the hall, the door to the service room stood slightly open, a narrow line of fluorescent light spilling into the corridor, and he slowed as he approached, the sound of movement inside faint but present, the soft shift of metal, the rustle of cloth, and he stopped just outside, not entering immediately, not announcing himself. Just standing there for a brief moment, listening, and inside, Amara was finishing, her small hands moving methodically as she folded the last cloth, aligning it carefully on the cart, her movements precise not because anyone required them to be, but because she did, because order mattered in ways that were simple and quiet and real, and she did not notice him at first, not until the subtle change in the doorway caught her attention, the shift of shadow against the floor, and she turned, her eyes lifting, meeting his without surprise, without fear, just recognition, and for a second either of them spoke, the silence between them not empty, but steady, carrying the weight of everything that had already been said without words. And Richard stepped inside then, just one step, enough to cross the threshold, enough to change the space, and the fluorescent light above flickered once, then steadied, casting a softer tone across his features than the sharp lighting of the boardroom had, and he looked at her, really looked, not as someone passing through, not as part of the background, but as a person standing in front of him, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had ever been in that building. "Why did you stop?" he asked, and Amara tilted her head slightly, not confused, but thoughtful, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the cart. "Stop what?" she asked gently, and he held her gaze for a second, then glanced toward the folder still in his hand, though he had not realized he was carrying it, and he lifted it slightly. You could have kept going, he said. You could have told me everything. And Amara looked at the folder, then back at him, her expression calm, grounded in a way that did not match her age, and she shook her head just a little. It was not mine to tell, she said, and the simplicity of the answer settled into the room like something undeniable, and Richard's grip on the folder loosened slightly, not dropping it, just releasing the tension he had been holding on to without noticing, and for a moment, he did not respond, not because he disagreed, but because the answer did not fit the way his world usually worked, where information was something to be uncovered, to be used, to be controlled, and yet here, in this small room, under the quiet hum of fluorescent lights, the rules felt different, and he nodded once, slowly, as if accepting something he did not yet fully understand, and then he asked, his voice even softer now, and if I wanted to understand the rest. And Amara's eyes shifted just slightly, not avoiding, but considering, and she lifted one hand, tapping lightly against the metal edge of the cart, a small, steady rhythm. Then you would not read it, she said. You would remember it. And the words landed without force, but they did not need to, because they carried something deeper than instruction, something that reached past logic into something more personal, and Richard stood there for a moment longer, the quiet of the room settling around them, and then he nodded again, this time more certain, more grounded, and he stepped back, not turning immediately, just giving the space back to what it had been before he entered, and as he moved toward the door, he paused once more, glancing back at her, and for the first time, there was something almost like a question in his expression, not spoken, not formed, just present. And Amara met it with a small, steady look, nothing more, nothing less, and he left, the door closing softly behind him, the sound quiet but complete, and inside the room, Amara stood still for a second, then returned to her work, her hands moving again, steady, certain, as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. The door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to linger longer than it should have, and as Richard stepped back into the corridor, the quiet followed him, not the empty kind, but something fuller, something that stayed just beneath the surface of everything around him, and for the first time in years, he did not reach for his phone, did not check the next meeting, did not calculate the next move, he simply stood there for a second, feeling the stillness settle into him in a way that felt unfamiliar and strangely necessary, and then he began to walk again, his pace slower now, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, each step measured not by urgency but by presence, and the hallway stretched ahead, the polished floor reflecting the overhead lights in long, steady lines that did not rush, did not demand, just existed, and as he moved, the building felt different, not because it had changed, but because he was noticing it differently. The faint hum of the ventilation system, the distant sound of an elevator opening and closing, the soft echo of footsteps somewhere far behind him, all of it forming a rhythm he had never paid attention to before, and he reached the glass wall that overlooked the city again, pausing just briefly as he had earlier, but this time, he did not see the skyline as something to conquer or expand. He saw it as something that moved on its own, independent of him, lights flickering in patterns that no one controlled completely, and he exhaled slowly, the breath steady, grounding, and then he turned, continuing down the corridor toward his office, the folder still in his hand, though he had almost forgotten it was there, and inside the service room, Amara finished aligning the last of the supplies, her hands moving with quiet precision as she adjusted the cloths and bottles into their proper places. Her world returning to its familiar structure, simple, clear, and she stepped back from the cart, her fingers brushing lightly against the metal frame, feeling the cool surface beneath her skin, and for a moment, she stood still, listening to the quiet hum of the room, the faint flicker of the fluorescent light above, the soft echo of the door closing moments earlier, and she did not rush to leave, did not move immediately, because something inside her had shifted too, not in a way that made her feel different from who she was, but in a way that made her feel more certain of it, and she reached for her small backpack resting against the wall, lifting it over her shoulder with a practiced motion, the strap settling comfortably against her hoodie, and she glanced once more at the cart, everything in place, everything as it should be, and she nodded slightly to herself, a quiet acknowledgement that her work here was done, and she moved toward the door, her steps light, steady, and when she opened it, the corridor outside greeted her with the same soft lighting, the same polished floor, but it did not feel exactly the same as before, not because it had changed, but because she had carried something through it, something that had touched a place most people did not even know existed. And she stepped out, closing the door gently behind her, the sound quiet but complete, and she began to walk toward the elevators, her pace unhurried, her mind calm, and upstairs, Richard entered his office again, the door closing behind him with a controlled softness, and he placed the folder back on his desk, not opening it this time, not reaching for it at all. Because he understood now that whatever it held was not something he could force into clarity, and he moved to the window once more. His reflection faint against the city lights, and he rested his hand lightly against the glass, feeling the cool surface grounding him, and the words returned again, "Not everything is meant to be solved, some things are meant to be felt first," and this time, he did not question them, did not try to analyze them, he let them sit, let them exist as they were, and something in his posture shifted, subtle but real. The tension that had defined him softening just enough to make space for something else, something quieter, something that did not need control to exist, and down the hall, Amara reached the elevator, pressing the button with a small, deliberate motion, the light above it flickering on in response, and she waited, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her breathing steady, and when the doors opened, she stepped inside, turning to face forward as the doors closed gently in front of her, sealing the space into a quiet, moving box that carried her down through the building, past floors filled with people and decisions and things she was not part of, and yet had touched in a way none of them expected, and as the elevator descended, the faint hum of its movement filled the space, steady and even, and she leaned back just slightly, her shoulders relaxing, her eyes lifting toward the numbers above the door as they changed one by one, and when the doors finally opened again, she stepped out into the lower level. The air cooler, the lighting softer, and she moved toward the exit, her steps light, her presence quiet, and outside, the night air greeted her with a gentle chill, the city stretching out in front of her, alive and moving, and she stepped into it without hesitation, without looking back, because she did not need to, and inside the building, several floors above, Richard Caldwell stood alone in his office, his hand still resting against the glass, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel the need to reach for something more, because for once, something had reached him first. The night air wrapped around Amara as she stepped fully onto the sidewalk, cool and steady, carrying the distant sounds of traffic, footsteps, and conversations that blended into the rhythm of the city, and she pulled her hoodie slightly closer around her shoulders, not out of discomfort, but out of habit, grounding herself in something familiar as she began to walk. Her small figure moving easily among the larger flow of people who barely noticed her, each person caught in their own direction, their own urgency, their own thoughts, and she did not mind it, she never had, because being unseen had always given her space to observe, to listen, to feel things others missed, and tonight, that quiet awareness felt different, not heavier, not overwhelming, just deeper, like something had opened inside her and settled there, steady and calm, and as she crossed the street under the soft glow of a traffic light, she glanced up briefly at the towering building behind her, its glass surface reflecting the city lights like a second sky, and for a moment she stood still, not long, just enough to take it in, and then she turned away, continuing forward without hesitation, her steps light, certain, as if she trusted the path ahead without needing to see all of it, and several floors above, in a room of glass and quiet, Richard remained by the window, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defined by tension or control, but by something softer, something that allowed stillness to exist without needing to fill it, and the folder on his desk remained closed, untouched, not ignored, but respected in a way he had not understood before, and he moved slowly away from the window, his hand trailing lightly along the edge of his desk as he passed, feeling the solid surface beneath his fingertips as if reconnecting with something physical, something real, and he stopped at the chair behind it, resting his hand briefly on the back, But he did not sit, not yet, because sitting would have meant returning to a pattern he was not ready to resume, and instead, he looked again at the folder, his gaze steady, not searching, not demanding, just present, and after a moment, he reached for it, lifting it gently, almost carefully, and he opened it once more, not to analyze, not to decode, but simply to see, and the symbols stared back at him. Unchanged, yet completely different, because now he did not try to force them into meaning, he let them exist, let them move in the way they were meant to, and slowly, almost without thinking, his finger traced a path along the page, following the curve the way Amara had, not perfectly, not with the same instinct, but enough to feel something beneath it, something subtle, something that did not reveal itself through logic but through presence. And his breath slowed, steadying into a rhythm that matched the movement of his hand, and for a moment, he closed his eyes again, not to escape, but to allow the feeling to deepen, and something surfaced, not a clear image, not a complete memory, but a fragment, a moment, something small and distant that he had not visited in years, and when he opened his eyes, his expression had softened further, not dramatically, but enough that the sharp edges of his usual composure had eased. And he exhaled slowly, letting the breath carry whatever had risen back into the quiet space around him, not pushing it away, not holding on to it, just letting it be. And down on the street, Amara reached the corner where the city thinned just slightly, the noise softening as she turned onto a quieter block, the lights dimmer, the pace slower, and she walked with the same steady rhythm, her mind no longer focused on what had happened, but not forgetting it either, simply holding it as part of her. The way she held everything she noticed, everything she felt, without needing to explain it, and as she passed the storefront window, she caught her reflection again, small against the glass, moving through a world much larger than her, and she smiled softly, not because anything had changed on the outside, but because something had shifted on the inside, something that did not need recognition to be real, and she continued forward, disappearing gradually into the rhythm of the city, her presence blending back into the flow, and upstairs, Richard closed the folder again, not out of finality, but out of understanding, his hand resting on it for a moment longer before he placed it gently on the desk, and this time, when he stepped back, he did not feel the need to return to it, not immediately, not urgently, because he knew now that whatever it held would not be lost if he did not chase it, and he turned once more toward the window, the city stretching out before him, alive, moving, and for the first time, he did not see it as something to control or predict, but as something to witness, something to exist within rather than above, and he stood there in the quiet, the light reflecting softly across the glass, his breathing steady, his posture calm. And in that stillness, something settled fully, something that had been shifting since the moment a small voice had spoken in a room full of certainty, and though no one else in the building could see it, could measure it, could define it, the change was real, quiet, and complete, and somewhere far below, a girl walked home through the city lights, carrying nothing visible, yet leaving something behind that would remain long after the moment had passed. Morning came slowly to the city, not with silence but with a gradual layering of sound, engines starting, footsteps returning, glass doors opening and closing as the building filled again with people who carried purpose in their posture and urgency in their pace, and inside, everything looked the same, the polished floors, the quiet corridors, the reflection of movement in every surface, as if nothing had happened the night before. And yet something had, something small and invisible that did not leave marks but shifted weight, and several floors above the lobby, Richard stood in his office once more, dressed as he always was, composed, precise, the structure of his world restored on the surface, but his movements carried a difference that could not be measured, not slower, not uncertain, just aware, as if each step connected to something beyond the next decision, and the folder still rested on his desk, exactly where he had left it, untouched since the night before, and for a moment, he looked at it, not with urgency, not with pressure, but with a quiet understanding that it no longer demanded anything from him, and he turned away. Moving toward the window again, the morning light softer than the sharp glare of midday, casting a pale reflection of the city that was still waking, and he rested his hand lightly against the glass, the same place as before, the same gesture, but not the same meaning, because now it was not about distance, not about separation, it was about connection, something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. And down in the service corridor, Amara moved through her routine again. Her small cart rolling steadily beside her, the familiar rhythm returning with ease, cloth in hand. Circular motions across the glass, clearing away fingerprints and smudges left behind by people who never noticed them, and she did not look for anything more, did not expect anything to be different, because her world did not rely on moments to define it, it relied on consistency, on quiet care, on showing up and doing what needed to be done without needing recognition. And yet, when she passed the boardroom again, her steps slowed just slightly, not enough to draw attention, just enough to notice the reflection in the glass, empty now, chairs aligned, table cleared, as if the intensity of the previous day had been folded away and stored out of sight, and she paused for a brief second, her hand hovering near the glass, not touching it, just acknowledging the space, and then she moved on, her steps returning to their steady rhythm, because she understood something others did not. That moments did not need to be held onto to matter, they simply needed to be lived. And upstairs, Richard turned from the window, his gaze shifting briefly to the desk, to the folder, and then to the door, and without overthinking it, without planning it, he stepped out into the hallway, his pace steady, his direction clear in a way that did not come from habit, and as he walked, people greeted him with the same quiet respect, the same subtle acknowledgement of his presence. But today, he noticed them, not individually, not in detail, but as part of the world he moved through, not above, and he continued down the corridor, past offices, past glass walls, until he reached the service area, the softer lighting greeting him again. The quieter hum of a different rhythm, and he did not hesitate this time. He stepped into the hallway fully, his presence no longer an intrusion, but something intentional, and at the far end, Amara stood at another panel, her cloth moving in smooth circles, her focus steady, her posture relaxed, and she did not notice him immediately, not until he spoke, her name carrying softly across the space. Amara! And she turned, her eyes meeting his without surprise, just the same quiet recognition as before, and for a moment, they stood there again, two worlds intersecting. In a space that belonged to either of them fully, and he took a few steps closer, not rushing, not imposing, just closing the distance with intention, and when he stopped, he did not speak right away, as if choosing his words not for impact, but for truth, and then he said, "I remembered something." And the statement was simple, but it carried more weight than anything he had said before, because it was not about the code, not about the patterns, it was about what had been beneath them all. Alone, and Amara tilted her head slightly, her eyes attentive, not expecting, not demanding, just present, and he continued, his voice steady. "I have been trying to solve things my whole life," he said, "but I stopped feeling them a long time ago." And the admission settled into the quiet space between them, not heavy, not dramatic, just real, and Amara did not respond immediately, she simply looked at him, her expression calm, grounded, as if she understood without needing explanation, and then she gave a small nod, a simple acknowledgement that required nothing more, and Richard exhaled softly, the breath steady, and for the first time, there was no tension behind it, no pressure to move forward or fix something, just a quiet release, and he glanced briefly at the glass panel she had been cleaning, the surface now clear, reflecting both of them in the same frame, not divided by distance, not separated by status, just two figures standing side by side in the same light, and he said one last thing, not as a command, not as a conclusion, but as a recognition. "Thank you?" And the words were quiet, but they carried something that could not be measured, something that did not need to be repeated, and Amara smiled softly, the same small, steady smile she had given herself the night before, and she returned to her work, her cloth moving again in smooth circles, the rhythm continuing, unchanged, and Richard stood there for a moment longer, watching, not as someone in control, but as someone present, and then he turned, walking back down the corridor, his steps steady, his posture calm, carrying nothing visible, yet different in a way that would shape everything that followed, and behind him, the glass reflected the light, the movement, the quiet connection that had formed and settled without needing to be named, and in that reflection, something remained, something simple, something true, that kindness is not weakness, it is the clearest form of strength.